Chapter 26. Gabe had done exactly what Gertrude told him to do. He rode toward the castle and into the village, left his mount with the innkeeper, and presented himself at the castle as a minstrel. He was given entry. The evening meal was being cleared, but he didn't think he could stomach much anyway. A pretty, young serving girl smiled, offering him what appeared to be round, flat bread. "You're a bit late for the meal, but here's a bannock. I could maybe find you some cheese or cold meat if you want it." He smiled back at her. "Nay, thank you, this'll be fine." He ate a few bites of it. It was a bit like a dense biscuit. It sat well enough on his unsettled stomach. "The minstrels usually sleep over there." She motioned to a corner of the hall, where there did indeed appear to be a number of people with a variety of instruments. He ambled toward them, eating the rest of the bannock, not exactly sure what to do. A man with dark hair and a wooden recorder watched Gabe approach. "Look, Paul! A newcomer with a lute, just the thing we need." Another man sitting nearby with a large drum next to him nodded. "Aye, there's a lot of wind amongst the musicians here. A few drums and the odd harper, but he's the first lute to arrive." "I'm Geordie." "Come join us, young Geordie." "Thank you." Gabe sat with them. "I'm Robin. This is Paul, and the lovely lass beside him is his wife, Jean. We travel together." "It's nice to meet you." "Care to show us what you could do with that lute?" asked Paul. Sure." Gabe took the lute from his back. It looked very much like a mandolin, with strings in pairs. His mandolin had 12 strings arranged in 6 pairs. He had seen lutes with many more sets of strings, but this one had 11 strings, 5 pairs plus a single string for the highest pitches. He plucked the strings to check the tuning. The lute seemed to be tuned in fifths, as was his modern mandolin. Instinctively he adjusted the pegs. He played a few bars of an Italian folk song. He could do this. Gertrude's words came to him. "If you allow it, his melodies will guide your fingers." He relaxed and let the medieval minstrel take over. As he started to play, Paul picked up his drum and added a driving rhythm. A broad smile spread across Robin's face as he joined in with his recorder to play a counter-melody. Jean added her sweet, lilting voice to the mix, joined by Paul on the refrain. Gabe could only describe it as magical. He had never heard the tune before, but just as Gertrude promised, it flowed from within him. When they had finished the song, there was silence in the hall for a moment before it erupted into applause and hoots of appreciation. Robin glanced at Paul, raising an eyebrow as if communicating an unspoken question. Paul nodded. "Geordie, that was truly excellent. Would you like to perform with us?" "I'd like that. As long as I'm here, that is. I may not be staying long." Paul laughed. "None of us will be staying long. We're minstrels, lad. Or had you failed to notice? Robin is asking if you want to join up with us. Stay together, you can. Travel with us." Travel with them? This could be fun. As long as he remained in the 13th century, he should experience what he could. What can go wrong? I can leave at any moment. Over the next few days, Gabe jammed with his medieval friends. It wasn't long before his own musical abilities blended with Geordie's. Gabe knew he added a slightly 20th century edge to their combined sound, making them unique. That and the fact that they had a woman singing with them garnered no small amount of attention. When he thought about it, Gabe had to laugh. He was a member of the most popular band around. It hadn't been what he'd expected when he put the watch chain around his neck, but he was having a blast. On Christmas Eve he sat near one of the hearths, plucking at his lute, and watching as the hall was prepared for the Christmas feast. He noticed a little girl standing shyly off to one side, and watching him play. He smiled at her. She reminded him of Angela. "Good evening, lass. What's your name?" "Keena." "How old are you, Keena?" "Almost 6. He smiled. Angela's birthday was Christmas Eve, and she had been almost 6 since about August. "When will you be 6? She smiled. "I was born on the Epiphany, the 12th day of Christmas. My sister was born on Christmas Eve." It was out of his mouth before he realized it. "You have a sister? How old is she? Where does she live?" "My sister, well, my whole family—" What could he say? Geordie's family had all passed away, but his family hadn't even been born yet. "My family is in heaven with the angels." "All of them? I'm sorry." "It's all right, Keena. I have friends here, and someday I'll see my family again." "I like the music you play." "Thank you." "Did your sister like music?" "Aye, she did." "Would you play me a song that she liked?" Gabe thought for a moment before plucking the melody to a lullaby he had sung Angela many times about asking guardian angels to keep her all through the night. When he finished and looked up, the little girl smiled. "I like that song. Do you know any other angel songs?" Gabe smiled. Billy Joel had an angel lullaby on the album he had released last year. Gabe loved the song and had wanted his band to do a cover of it, but had been voted down. He learnt it anyway, to the delight of his baby sister. He played it for the little medieval girl, who closed her eyes as she listened, and only opened them as the last notes faded away. "I like that song too. Will you play another one? I like angels." She sat down in front of him, looking expectant. Gabe laughed, reminded again of Angela. "I know a few more." He switched to Christmas carols. There were angels aplenty to be found there. As he played and sang, a vague sense of homesickness grew within him. He had never been anywhere but home with his family on Christmas Eve. "Stop being an idiot, Gabe. You'll be home for Christmas." After he had sung a few more, he heard someone calling her name. "Is that you they're calling, or some other wee lass named Keena?" She sighed. "That's my nursemaid. I have to go." She hopped up. "Thank you for singing to me. I liked it." She ran toward the woman who called her. "That was brilliant." Robin walked toward him and sat down. "What was brilliant about it?" "Do you know who you were serenading?" "She told me her name was Keena. Is there more to know?" "She's Keena McCrae, Laird McCrae's oldest child." Gabe frowned. "Did I do something wrong?" "Nay, far from it. She seemed enthralled. That could serve us very well." "I don't understand." "Geordie, you're a great musician, but it's a wonder you don't starve to death. After the Epiphany, when the feasts are over, Laird McCrae will not allow all other minstrels here to stay. He won't want to feed that many extra mouths. But most noble houses have a few minstrels in residence all of the time. Our goal, the goal of every minstrel here, is to be asked to stay through the winter months." "I didn't know that." Gabe would only stay until the middle of February anyway. "Like I said, it's a wonder you haven't starved. But now you know. I expect you can see why having admirers in the Laird's family could give us an advantage." "I suppose so." Gabe became instantly aware that this wasn't simply a lark for Robin. As carefree and easy as the minstrel's life seemed, those who were here, all of them, were just trying to keep body and soul together for one more day. Being popular in the 13th century didn't mean screaming groupies. It meant having a roof to sleep under and food to eat. Although being asked to stay at Castle McCrae for the rest of the winter didn't matter much to Gabe, he wanted to do everything he could to see that Jean, Paul, and Robin got to stay. To Gabe's surprise, 3 separate Christmas masses were celebrated: the Angels' Mass at midnight, the Shepherd's Mass at dawn, and the Mass of the Divine Word later in the morning. While the great hall had been decorated with greenery, there was no Christmas tree and no gifts exchanged. However, when the feasting started in the early afternoon, it was lavish and went on for hours. At some point after the meal was over and the dancing was in full swing, Gabe's eyes were drawn to a girl. She whirled and danced as if she were one with the music. She was beautiful, and Gabe felt a connection to her through the music, like nothing he had ever experienced before. When he was finally free, he searched the crowd for her, finally spotted her sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and a tankard of ale in her hand. She looked just as absorbed by the music as she had been while she was dancing. She looked at him, catching him watching her. He'd better make a move or wind up looking goofy just staring at her. He walked toward her. "Do you mind if I sit here with you?" "Nay, it's fine." He sat next to her. "My name's Geordie." "I'm Elsie. You and your friends were wonderful." "Thank you." "I love music." He smiled broadly. "I do too. But what I love most is seeing the pleasure people take from music. When the tune leaves my fingers and reaches the hearts of those listening, it gives me joy. When it stirs their feet and they dance, becoming one with the melody, we are connected in an extraordinary way. It feeds my soul." She stared at him with a slightly awed expression. It's just so for me. I mean, I can't make music, but dancing, letting the music flow through me, there is nothing else like it. I have to confess, I've watched you dancing all night. I've barely been able to take my eyes off you. You're lovely, and when you dance, I don't think I've ever seen anything more beautiful. I dreaded the last note of every song, because it severed that momentary connection between us. He caressed her cheek with his fingertips. "So beautiful. If only I could stay with you," was on the tip of his tongue. Where had that come from? She blushed. "If only what?" Her voice was breathy. He smiled sadly. "'Tis nothing." Elsie glanced around. I suppose I should be going home. It's late." "Will you be here again tomorrow?" She nodded. "Aye, I will." He stood and offered her a hand. "I'll look forward to it." She took his hand, allowing him to help her stand. "So will I. I always do." "Until tomorrow, then." For some unknown reason, he kissed the back of her hand. He had never in his life done anything like that. Maybe that was one of Geordie's memories, but it had evidently been the right thing to do. She nodded, her blush growing deeper. "Until tomorrow." She turned to leave. He couldn't let her leave without asking her for a date. But how did one do that here? "Elsie, I was just thinking, we won't be playing until after the feast. Will you sit with me?" "Sit with you?" "Aye, during the feast." She smiled. "Aye, I'd like that. I'll look for you." Chapter 27. March 23rd, 2006. The Sinclairs' Library. Elsie could scarcely believe what she was hearing. "It was you. You were Geordie?" "Yes." "And you would have left your family forever to stay with me?" "Yes. Even though the only skill I had was as a minstrel, I would have stayed." She laughed. "I had decided that if you asked, I would go with you." Although I'd initially intended to ask just that, I realized it would have been a mistake. You clearly loved learning to be a midwife. Not only was it a skill that would make you valuable to the clan, it gave you a sense of purpose. I understood that, and I didn't want to take it away from you. I still would have stayed, even if it meant being a laborer. The morning you found me in the church, I was praying for guidance. You were so very sad. I wanted to offer you comfort. I wanted to be there for you always. The baby was dying. It happens often enough, but it is always heart-rending. I remember. You said her lips and fingers were blue, and that it got worse when she cried. Even then, I knew she wasn't getting enough oxygen in her blood. Could you have helped her now? I expect so. It could have been any number of things, all of which could be treated here. It made me think long and hard about my future. Even that didn't change my mind. I planned to tell you who I was and that I intended to stay if you would marry me. But I knew you'd been up all night and needed rest first. I was heading to see you that afternoon when one of Laird Macrae's guardsmen dragged you past me into the keep. I was already gone then. The change happened while Drummond was hauling me through the village. Oh, my God. The person I saw was Elizabeth? Yes. I tried to help, but the guard told me to mind my own business. I was worried, so I slipped inside to see what was going on. There were men waiting in the hall. They must have been the Mackenzies. That's what one of the serving maids told me. I waited to see what was happening. After a little while, I heard people on the stairs and hid. The laird emerged from the stairs with you, or Elizabeth, it would seem, and the big guardsman. I couldn't hear what was going on. She didn't seem upset and went with them without a single farewell. Now I know why. At first I was crushed, but then the laird told your aunt and the whole clan what had happened. He said the Mackenzies came seeking a midwife, but after he had sent them away, you lied to them about your skills in order to get them to take you along. I would never have done that, she said vehemently. I knew you wouldn't have, and your aunt didn't believe him either. Except for the guardsman, I may have been the only one to see you, or her, being dragged to the keep and handed over to them. I didn't understand why Laird McCrae was lying, and I started asking questions, but I got nowhere. I even tried to talk my friends into going with me to the Mackenzies. I was worried about you. But Robin said herring after them in the dead of winter was foolhardy. He said if you hadn't been returned by Easter, they'd go with me to the Mackenzie holding then. But as you know, my time was limited. I just had a week left on the pocket watch. I intended to stay if you wanted to marry me, but if you didn't, I had to find out. So you went after her? Gabe nodded. I guess my asking questions hadn't gone unnoticed. I was followed and attacked. The big guardsman who had dragged her to the keep was one of my attackers. He stabbed me in the gut. I whispered the return word just as I lost consciousness, and woke seconds later in my own bed. I believed I had lost you forever. Gabe's voice sounded bereft. I had hoped Gertrude would find me again. I wanted another chance. At the very least, I wanted to know what had happened to you. I wanted to know you were safe. She smiled and took his hand. I'm sorry it has taken 11 years for you to find out, but I'm safe, and I do love you. That must be why my feelings for you were so strong. Elizabeth's brain might have recognized Gabriel Soldani, but my heart recognized Geordie. I'm certain you're right. The way this feels is intense and different. You're the first woman I ever loved. It was you, and not Elizabeth, who loved me. Elizabeth might have too, I don't know, but I'm certain my feelings are my own. Elsie, this should be proof enough that we're meant to be together. We're soulmates. Like your parents, our souls have been pulled through time, twice, to ensure we're together. Gabe got down on one knee. Please, Elsie, marry me. I want to marry you, and spend the rest of my days here with you as my husband. My parents also desperately want me to stay. Tears sprang to Elsie's eyes. But what about Elizabeth? My darling, I can only believe that her soul is where it belongs as well. How can you be so sure? She hasn't come back yet. But she was meant to help Lady Mackenzie. Yes, she was. But based on what you've told me, I suspect Lady Mackenzie has a condition known as an incompetent cervix that prevents her from carrying a child to term. Elizabeth would have been able to diagnose her and tell her what she needed to do immediately. After that, there's nothing else that could be done, so she could have returned weeks ago. But she hasn't. Something is holding her there, as surely as our love holds you here. Could it be? Could she actually stay here forever? It was what she wanted more than anything. Somehow she knew the first step was declaring her intention. Yes, Gabe, I'll marry you. He pulled the box from his pocket and slipped the ring on her finger. Gabe, this is beautiful. What is it for? He grinned. In this time, when a woman agrees to marry a man, he gives her a ring. It's called an engagement ring. She wears it as a sign of the promise to marry him. This ring is the one my grandfather gave to my grandmother when they were engaged. It's beautiful. He gathered her in his arms and kissed her. When he broke the kiss, he rested his forehead on hers. "I swear to you, I will always love you and care for you. Time will not part us." There was a tap at the library door a moment before it opened. Gertrude stepped into the room, positively beaming. "I see you've sorted things out nicely." Fear coursed through Elsie, and she tightened her grip on Gabe. "Gertrude, please, I want to stay. And that is just what you are intended to do, lass. Souls are rearranged for a multitude of reasons. The two of you were truly destined for each other, but Gabriel was equally destined to be a doctor." "And Elizabeth wasn't?" Elsie asked hesitantly. "Aye, she was, just not here. Her skills were needed in another time and place, and her heart belonged there too." Gertrude grinned slyly. "She fell in love ages ago, and made the decision to stay. You just needed a little extra time to discover your heart's desire." "My parents will be excited. I suspect they were worried you'd come to tell me it was time to trade souls again." "Sweetling, they don't know I'm here. You're well aware that I have a way of coming and going unnoticed. Still, I have no doubt they will be thrilled. Their greatest regret has always been leaving you. And yet, this is where your father belonged. He had a hunger for knowledge that was unmatched, and he could never have been satisfied in your own time. But more than that, he has a compassionate heart. His businesses are not only sound and profitable, but his employees are treated well and compensated fairly. His wealth supports medical research, global clean water initiatives, famine relief, and charities intended to promote the safety and advancement of women around the world." She winked at Gabe. "I even understand he is the major contributor to a new pediatric wing at NYUHC." Gabe smiled. "Funny, I heard the same thing." Gertrude caressed Elsie's cheek with one hand. "I know your life until now has been difficult, made harder still by losing your parents when you were so very young. But I cannot apologize for that. Unlike your parents, I have no regrets. I provide the means for gifts to be used to their fullest advantage in the place where they will have the greatest benefit. Even so, each person makes their own choices. The fact is that Alder McCrae was born with tremendous potential and absolutely no way to achieve it. Aldous Sinclair was born completely blind to the advantages and potential with which he had been gifted. But young Aldous, with full knowledge of the risks he took, he had been injured before when climbing over the fence, made his choice. When presented with opportunity, Alder McCrae made his as well. But Gabe wasn't able to stay with me in the past. That wasn't where his gifts were needed, pet. His potential here was yet to be achieved. I gave him the opportunity to learn some valuable lessons from you first." "What could I teach him?" Gabe smiled. "You helped me recognize the gift I had already been given, an opportunity for education. You embraced the ability to learn midwifery, a skill that would be infinitely valuable to your clan. You found a sense of purpose in that. I had the opportunity to become a doctor and had been willing to throw it away to live a musician's life. When you told me about the baby who was dying, I was reminded of what I could achieve in the future, versus my complete lack of real skills in the past. But you said you were prepared to stay with me anyway." "I was, but the man who murdered me took that decision from me. I suppose that was for the best. However, I had been wrestling with my career choice before I used the pocket watch. When I came back, the things I had learned from you, and the love and respect I had for you made my choice clear." He cocked his head and looked at Gertrude. Of course, I fully believed that I had found my true love, only to lose her forever. Gertrude smiled indulgently. "Once love is found, it is never truly lost. It may evolve. Loved ones may be separated for a while by time and space, but love exists forever. Thus, loving someone is a marathon, not a sprint. Yes, A wise woman once told me that. Gertrude chuckled. You understand it now, do you? I think I do. But what would have happened if Elizabeth had returned? We'll never know for certain. But she did actually have strong feelings for you. When Elsie recognized you, part of it was Elizabeth's memories at work. If Elizabeth had elected to return, the two of you would have rediscovered the affection you held for each other. You and Elizabeth are compatible and would have had a loving marriage, and a Mackenzie guardsman would have been Elsie's solace after losing Geordie. Each of you would have loved your partner, but it would never have been as it is between the two of you. It's as you said, Gabe. Elsie is your true soulmate. Gabe kissed the top of Elsie's head. I couldn't agree more. Gertrude smiled indulgently for a moment. Part of the job is done now, but you've still got a few things to sort out. Elsie nodded, but Gabe's brows drew together. What still has to be sorted out? Elizabeth's parents, said Elsie. But they've accepted the diagnosis of fugue. That's not the whole of it. Charlotte knows I'm not Elizabeth. You told her and not me? It was an accident when I told her. I slipped and referred to Elizabeth as another person. Charlotte was all over that, and ready to have me committed. It took a visit from Gertrude to convince her, and I thought I was intended to help you fall in love with Elizabeth. Telling you would have ruined that. But there is more to it than that, said Gertrude. A rift had formed between Elizabeth and her parents long before she took the pocket watch. That rift can be mended. But Elsie isn't their daughter Elizabeth, and now she never will be. Gertrude shook her head. Of course she is their daughter. You're a doctor. Do I need to explain biology to you? Gabe shook his head. No, but that's not what I meant. The Elizabeth they know is gone. Not completely. Gabe, you know what it is like to be in another's body. You have a bit of them with you. You were able to play medieval music on a lute, were you not? He nodded. So they have lost part of the old Elizabeth, who they had nearly lost anyway. But it would be wrong to allow that rift to grow. Elsie is right. Elizabeth's parents must be told. I agree that we need to tell Charlotte, said Elsie. She's accepted things as they are because she believes Elizabeth is coming back. This will be a blow to her. But I haven't spoken to Dr. Quinn since that day in the hospital. He hasn't contacted me or even attempted a visit. There's nothing to tell him. Tell me, Elsie, did you contact or visit him? As soon as Gertrude said it, Elsie felt like a prime idiot. She shook her head. No, I didn't. Gertrude patted her on the arm. Don't be too hard on yourself. Simply becoming accustomed to life here was a monumental task. If Elizabeth were coming back, connecting with her mother in the short term would have been sufficient. But now that you have elected to stay, you must reach out to him as well. Gabe stiffened. You don't mean to tell him about the pocket watch? He'll be convinced that we're all crazy. Gertrude laughed merrily. Nay, of course not. But you must help him face the fact that Elizabeth's memories, other than her love for Gabe, have not returned and may never return. Only after he accepts that will he be ready to be a father to Elizabeth as she is now. I'm not sure he can be convinced, said Gabe. Fugues nearly always resolve. The operative word being nearly, said Gertrude. The fact is, fugues don't always resolve, and while both Dr. Rose and Dr. Levi have agreed on a diagnosis of fugue, in the absence of a documentable physical cause, they also both agree Elizabeth's condition is extremely atypical. James is a doctor, so use science. Joe may be an asset there. Gabe nodded. That could work. There is one last thing. Do you remember the return word? The word I told you not to say when you woke in the hospital? The return word? Asked Elsie. I'm sorry, I don't think so. It was a terribly odd word. Why do I need to know it now? We've both decided to stay. Yes, and while I am certain neither of you will change your mind, You continue to have free will, so you could theoretically still change places for the next 22 days, while the return word remains active. The colour drained from Gabe's face. Dear God, I hadn't thought of that. There isn't much cause for worry. As Elsie said, it's an odd word, and she was never likely to say it accidentally, but we cannot risk it. So, Elsie, the word you must not say is Nintendo Core. Elsie nodded. I didn't ask before, but just out of curiosity, what is it? It's a music genre, said Gertrude. Gabe shook his head. I've never heard of it. How on earth did Elizabeth decide on that as the return word? That's another story altogether. The important thing is that Elsie must not say it in the next 22 days. My lips are sealed. And with that, my work here is done. However, I will offer you one last bit of advice. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. Love is a marathon, not a sprint. You are soulmates, but that doesn't mean your life will always be perfect. You will hit rough patches as everyone does. Be steadfast. Remember your love for each other, and aim for that finish line many miles down the road, not the fast, easy solution. She smiled broadly at them both and opened her arms. Now give me a hug. I must be going. They hugged her, and Elsie said, Won't you stay long enough to see my parents? I know they'd love it. And they might, but they have no need to see me. I am needed elsewhere. With that, she dissolved into mist. Elsie looked at Gabe. I wonder if we'll ever need to see her again. Part of me hopes not. I think in this case, no news is good news. Speaking of good news, let's go tell your parents. The Sinclairs were as overjoyed as they were relieved. Elsie's mother took her hand. When I found out you had come forward, I was ecstatic. It was a miracle I'd never dared hope for. When I learned you would probably have to leave again, I vowed to make the most of our time together. And yet I knew it would never be enough. I prayed fervently that Elizabeth would elect to stay in the past. But I was the one who would have to say the word. Oh, my precious child, I know you. You would not have said the word until Elizabeth completed her task, and I doubted you could be convinced to force her to stay in the past, if she wanted to come back. I fear I'd almost decided to do that, just before Gertrude told us it wasn't necessary. Her mother hugged her. You are a good woman, and thanks be to God that you didn't have to make that choice. Her father put his arms round them both, kissing Elsie's head. Our little lost bird is returned. Chapter 28. Charlotte Quinn stood staring out her office window. She was not one given to tears, ever, not even as a child. She couldn't remember the last time she cried, but tears slipped silently down her cheeks now. Her daughter was gone. Elsie had called a little while ago. Hi, would you have a little time later? I need to talk with you. I'm a bit busy today. Maybe we can have dinner tomorrow? There was a pregnant pause before Elsie said, I'd love to have dinner with you tomorrow, but this can't wait. We could have a late dinner this evening. It would be better if we had privacy. Charlotte's hopes had soared. If Elsie needed to talk privately and the issue couldn't wait, perhaps it meant she and Elizabeth would be switching places soon. All right, come to my office. The address is on the card I gave you. I'll make time for you when you get here. Elsie arrived, accompanied by Gabriel Soldani, within the hour. Charlotte finished the telephone conference she was on before her assistant showed them in. But Elsie had not brought news of when Elizabeth would be returning, because Elizabeth would never be returning. Charlotte had wanted to rail at Elsie and Gabe. She wanted this to be their fault. Elizabeth had made the independent decision to stay in the past. Yes, Elsie and Gabe were happy about it, but it seemed Elizabeth hadn't known that when she elected to stay. Elsie had said something about wanting to stay in Charlotte's life. Charlotte hadn't really processed it. Yes, I'm sure we'll see each other again. Now, I'm terribly sorry to rush you out, but as I mentioned on the phone, my schedule is overbooked this afternoon. I'll have my assistant call and set up some time to chat next week. But I said I'm busy. We'll discuss this some other time. The words had appeared to crush Elsie, but Charlotte was feeling too crushed herself to say any more. Gabriel Soldani stood and took Elsie's hand. "Come, Elsie. There'll be time." When they were gone, Charlotte called her assistant. "Clear my schedule. I'm not feeling well." Charlotte wasn't sure how long ago that was. She was still trying to process the fact that her daughter was lost to her forever when her intercom buzzed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Quinn. There's a woman here insisting on seeing you. I've told her there's no time in your schedule, but she's adamant that you will see her. She says her name is Gertrude." Charlotte swiped the tears from her cheeks and took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Yes, I'll see her. Send her in." "Good afternoon, Charlotte. I hope I'm not disrupting your afternoon overmuch. Thank you for squeezing me in. I'm fairly certain you are aware that I cleared my schedule. But if I hadn't, I certainly would have made time to see the woman who lured my daughter away from me." Charlotte found it nearly impossible to keep the bitterness from her tone. Gertrude tisked as she sat in one of the visitors' chairs without being invited. "I did nothing of the sort. I offered Elizabeth an opportunity. The choice was completely hers, as was the choice to stay in the 13th century. Are you saying my daughter, my only child, chose to leave us forever? Charlotte, leaving you was not the choice. It was only a consequence. She discovered her true destiny and chose to follow it. That doesn't change the fact that Elizabeth is lost to me forever." Charlotte's heart ached unbearably. "I see. You spent a lot of time with Elizabeth? The two of you were very close?" "Yes, we were close. Well, not terribly close, I guess. We both have careers. But you were close when she was younger. She has always been a bright, driven young woman focused on her future. So you were there at her side, cheering her on. She didn't need that. She was self-motivated." "Self-motivated? My, that sounds impressive. But I suspect the truth is more that you and your husband were absentee parents." Gertrude's words hit hard. "How dare you suggest that? Elizabeth had the absolute best of everything. I didn't suggest you were negligent. I said you were absent. Those are two very different things, and if you're truly honest with yourself, you'll agree. You and Dr. Quinn were very busy. Nannies, housekeepers, and teachers cared for Elizabeth. She did have the absolute best of everything, except her parents' time." Charlotte opened her mouth to defend her choices, but she simply couldn't when she looked into Gertrude's eyes. She looked away. "I know it's true. The fact is, as I told you when we first met, Elizabeth had been unhappy and floundering for some time. Ask David Sinclair if you don't believe me. She was searching for purpose in her life, and has not only found it, but she has also found the love she craved. Could you talk to her for me? Could you tell her I love her and I want her to come home? She still has time to come home, doesn't she? Mrs. Quinn, you're not listening. I know you love your daughter, but until she took the pocket watch, you barely had a relationship with her. I have just told you that not only has she found her destiny, but she's blissfully happy. Do you really want her to return to a life where she felt adrift? Do you want her to turn away from a love that completes her? Shall I tell you what will happen if she does?" Charlotte didn't want to hear this, but she didn't stop Gertrude. "If she comes home, she will return to her life as a doctor. She might rekindle her affection for Gabe, or find someone else, but any relationship in the future will pale in comparison to the love she knows now. For the most part, your lives will all return to the way they were, and you'll forget you almost lost her eventually. Other things will become more important once again. 'Twas already beginning to happen. When Elsie called earlier, you intended to put her off until tomorrow. And as for Elizabeth, after a glimpse of pure happiness, life here will become a sad, mundane existence. Is that what you want? No. But I don't want to lose my daughter. Choices like this are seldom easy. But for every sad consequence, there are multiple blessings. There's still more to this story. The skills Elizabeth passed on with such joy ensured that the Mackenzie women delivered healthier children for generations. In fact, you're here today because of her. In the 14th century, one of Elizabeth's heirs married the leader of Clan Matheson, from whom you're descended. Are you saying that my daughter is my great, however many times great-grandmother? Nay, of course I'm not saying that. Your daughter's physical body and DNA are still here in Manhattan. A McCrae lass named Elsie was your however many times great-grandmother. But your daughter's heart and mind and soul brought knowledge and skills to the clan from whom your forebears came. Had it not been for Elizabeth's legacy, her youngest great-granddaughter would probably never have been born. That sweet lass married Laird Matheson, becoming your ancestor. But there are other blessings here for you. What possible blessing could come from losing my daughter? Elsie is a fine lass, with a gentle heart. It was because of Elsie's goodness and sense of honour that she's here, and Elizabeth's body didn't die. Her noble choice changed the way things usually work. She, like Elizabeth, has found her soulmate. Elsie and Gabriel Soldani were meant to be together, and don't forget that she resides in your daughter's body. Her children will be your grandchildren, and if you allow her to, she'll embrace you and ensure that they are a part of your life. What's more, as painful as it may occasionally be, she'll be a living, loving reminder of what should always come first. Charlotte nodded sadly. You're right. The night the police arrived to tell us about the accident, I realized how very close we'd come to losing her. But we had already all but lost her. She looked at Gertrude again. My husband was furious that it took so long to inform us, but the officers said she hadn't listed us as emergency contacts. They only found us as quickly as they did because someone at the hospital recognized her. Gabriel. Charlotte nodded. It's a terrible thing to realize you've grown so distant from your child. When we arrived, she seemed so fragile and afraid, but she clung to Gabe instead of turning to us. James meant well. He just wanted to ensure she had the very best possible care. But he only made things worse. A lump rose in her throat, and she swallowed hard against it. When I learned about Elsie, it somehow made Elizabeth's rejection sting less. After all, it wasn't really her who refused to go home with us. But now, Elizabeth has turned from us again. Only this time it's forever. Charlotte, you're missing the point. She didn't turn away from you. She turned toward her true purpose, toward the life she longed for. Would you want anything less for her? No, of course not. Then rejoice in her happiness, and accept the gift that Elsie will be in your life. Love her. Let her love you in return. Celebrate the grandchildren she'll give you. Can you do that? Charlotte considered Gertrude's words. The truth in them was undeniable. Eventually, she nodded. I can. And don't lose sight of the fact that part of Elizabeth lives on in her, just as part of her remains with Elizabeth. They are essentially two sides of the same coin. Charlotte considered that for a moment. I guess you're saying that my daughter has changed, but she is still my daughter. Exactly. Remorse filled Charlotte. I sent her away. She came to talk to me, and in my grief, I sent her away. Gertrude smiled. She is a loving, forgiving woman. Reach out, and she'll return. Chapter 29. Elsie was thrilled when, after recovering from her initial shock, Charlotte reached out to her that evening. I'm sorry I hurt you this afternoon, darling. It was hard news to hear, but she is living a life she chose with a man she loves. I could not wish more for her than that. Charlotte sighed. Is living? I guess I should say lived. Her life ended centuries ago. I don't think of it that way, said Elsie. If I've learnt nothing else, it's that time is not linear. After all, Gertrude can pop back and forth between us. Maybe it's easier to think of her as just being somewhere else. She and Gabe had dinner with Charlotte the next evening to discuss the best way to handle Elizabeth's father. Maybe we should all go to Baltimore this weekend, said Charlotte. Gabe's brows drew together. We could, but I think if we hope to have him accept that Elizabeth may never recover her memories, perhaps he should come here. That way we can set up a meeting with Dr. Rose and perhaps Mrs. Sinclair. A meeting with Joe Sinclair? Why? While oldest Sinclair preferred that no one ever knew he had used the pocket watch, they agreed that if necessary, Elsie could tell Charlotte that Joe had. The fact that Joe was Elsie's mother would remain a secret, at least for now. Were you aware that Mrs. Sinclair once suffered profound retrograde amnesia? Charlotte nodded absently. Vaguely, but that was from a head injury, not a fugue. I understand that fugues generally resolve. I think James would see these as two entirely different situations. Elsie looked at her pointedly. You don't mean... Are you saying Joe Sinclair... Her point made, Elsie smiled. I'm saying she once suffered profound retrograde amnesia, from which she never recovered. Gabe nodded. If the goal is to help Dr. Quinn accept that Elizabeth's memories will not return, we may have an easier time of it with both Dr. Rose and Mrs. Sinclair available. I fear the harder part will be telling him Elsie and I are engaged. Charlotte nodded. You're right on both counts, but it must be done. I'll call him this evening. Elsie took a deep breath. I think I should call him. Are you sure, darling? I'm sure, Mom. Elsie had avoided ever calling Charlotte Mom, but she and Gabe had discussed it and agreed that had to change. In private, the Sinclairs were Mama and Da. Elsie needed to begin thinking of Charlotte and James Quinn as Mom and Dad. Charlotte took her hand and simply said, Thank you. When Elsie and Gabe returned to the apartment, Elsie sat at the table staring at the phone, trying to gather her courage. Elsie, you can't just sit there. The phone isn't going to dial itself. I know. Still, she didn't reach for it. Charlotte said she would call him. I know, but it's better if I do. Then you have to put on your big girl panties and do it. My big girl panties? It means to find your courage and do the mature adult thing. Call your dad. Okay, Elsie said resolutely. Good, he said, before leaning down to her ear and whispering, And when you're done, I'll take off your panties and do another mature adult thing. That's certainly incentive. Elsie picked up the phone and dialed. Hello? Hi, Dad. Elizabeth. Is something wrong, darling? No, I just wanted to talk to you. There was a brief pause. I'm sorry I upset you when you were in the hospital. I would have been happier if you'd agreed to come here, but I handled it badly. It's okay, Dad. I was so confused that day. The only thing that felt real to me was Gabe. I needed him. I probably needed you too, but he was my lifeline, and I thought you wanted rid of him. I did. Dad, I love him. I did years ago. I did that day, and I do now. I know, darling. Your mom has been keeping me updated. So you're okay with it? There was another longer pause. "Dad?" "Elizabeth, I'm not sure any father immediately believes the man his daughter loves is worthy of her, but I cannot deny he stepped up to the plate and chose to take care of you when I turned my back." "So you're okay with it?" "No, but I expect I will be someday." Elsie smiled. "Would you come up to New York this weekend?" "You don't want to come home and see if it jogs any memories?" "Nothing has jogged any memories, Dad. That's one reason I want you to come up here, so we can talk to Dr. Rose." "Dr. Rose? I did a little research on him." Elsie was worried about what was coming next, but she didn't interrupt. "It turns out that he is one of the world's leading experts on non-traumatic memory loss." "I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me. He has been really helpful." "Okay, I'll come up in the morning. See if Dr. Rose is available sometime after noon." She smiled at the curt order. "Sure. If I'm flying up there tomorrow, I have things I need to do. Good night, Elizabeth." "Good night, Dad." She hung up the phone. Gabe smiled at her. "That wasn't too bad, was it?" "No. However, you should know, he doesn't think you're worthy of me." Gabe shrugged. "I'm probably not, so I suppose it's fair." "What do you mean?" "Well, my dad adores you, and he has from the moment he met you. But Italian mothers rarely believe any woman is worthy of their son. My mom will take more convincing." She nodded sagely. "I expect I should start on that right away." "That's a good idea. We should go down sometime this week anyway, to tell them about the engagement." "We should, but we don't have to wait until then." "What do you mean?" "Your mom would be much happier if we don't sleep together until we're married." He laughed. "No, I don't think we want her that happy." She raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" "Positive." "Then I guess we can get to the taking my panties off part of the evening." "With pleasure." He scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the bedroom. Epilogue. Somewhere over the Atlantic, June 25th, 2006. Elsie had trouble taking her eyes off the window, even though there was nothing to see. "I can't believe I'm actually flying." Gabe chuckled. "So you've said, many times." Elsie blushed. "I know, I'm sorry. It is just so hard to believe." Gabe kissed her. "Sweetheart, you can say it as many times as you wish. One of the things that's delighted me from the moment we reconnected is the unbridled enthusiasm you show for things you enjoy." She grinned slyly. "You mean like this?" Putting a hand behind his neck, she pulled him down to her lips for a deep, passionate kiss. He ran a hand over the delicate fabric of her blouse, stopping to caress one breast and tease it to a firm peak even under her bra. She arched into his hand, reveling in his touch. When she broke the kiss, he smiled and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Just like that. But I should probably warn you, engaging in this sort of behavior on an airplane would normally be frowned upon." "Will you admit that letting my dog give us the use of his private jet for our honeymoon was a good idea?" "Yes, I'll admit that. I know you're not like either set of your parents where money is concerned, but it does make me a little uncomfortable from time to time." "A little uncomfortable?" When they first started discussing wedding plans, Gabe balked at the lavish affair Charlotte and James wanted to hold at the Engineers Club in Baltimore. Elsie feared all-out war would ensue between Gabe and her dad. Joe Sinclair, Elsie's matron of honor, provided gentle support, convincing the Quinns to hold the reception at an equally wonderful, but perhaps less ostentatious venue near Gabe's parents' home. The sculpture garden was perfect. "We understand your concerns," Joe had assured them privately. "You don't want to appear to be showing off, or creating a situation that might make your friends and family feel uncomfortable," added Aldous. "I hate to sound shallow or ungrateful, but you're right," said Gabe. Aldous nodded. I've learned that subtlety is often a wiser approach. The natural setting of the sculpture garden feels simpler and isn't an obvious show of wealth. I'm glad you understand. Elsie smiled at this memory. What neither of them knew at the time, and Gabe still didn't know, was that the sculpture garden had been booked by another couple ages in advance. The Sinclairs bought out the wedding party by completely paying for their weddings at another fabulous venue, after all parties signed non-disclosure agreements, of course. The other bride simply couldn't contain herself, broke the agreement, contacted Elsie, and gushed about how wonderful the Sinclairs were. Elsie thought it better to pretend she didn't know. Once Gabe had been confident that the Sinclairs understood his position, he said, "It isn't that I don't appreciate their desire to give us a wonderful wedding." "Of course not," agreed Joe. "And yet you want Elsie to have a memorable wedding. This solution gives you that," said Aldous. "Exactly," said Gabe. With a confident smile, Aldous had moved in for the kill. "That's exactly why Joe and I are keeping things very low-key. Our wedding gift to you is the use of our private jet to fly to your honeymoon." Gabe had been flabbergasted. "You can't be serious. You think a private jet is low-key?" "Of course it is. Your friends and family won't have any idea how you're getting to Italy. For all they know, you'll be flying coach on a commercial airline." "I'm sorry, sir. That's just... No. We can't accept it, but thank you." "Gabe, you just agreed you wanted the experience to be memorable without appearing too grandiose." "Yes, sir, I did, but—" "There is no but. A private jet is both memorable and, as the name suggests, private." Before Gabe could offer another argument, Aldous added, "Don't forget, this isn't about you and your wants. It's about our desire to have a hand in the wedding of a daughter who we can't publicly acknowledge. Do you realize how my heart will ache when James Quinn escorts my daughter down the aisle? Would you deny me this small opportunity to do something wonderful for her because of your pride?" "No, sir." "Then, to ensure a spectacular honeymoon for the woman you love, you'll accept our private gifts with grace." Yes. Thank you." Hadar was very good at this. Elsie was fully cognizant of the S at the end of the word gifts, but was certain Gabe had missed it at the time. She had no idea what else her parents might have done, but she was certain it didn't stop with the use of the jet. At the moment, she was simply glad Gabe had given in. "Okay, I was more than a little uncomfortable at first." Elsie became serious. "I know that. But you must know neither set of my parents do what they do because they think less of you. Dad finally came around after he spent time with you. He loves that you're a doctor." She gave him a sidelong glance. "Even if you're not a surgeon, the Sinclairs will always be grateful because you convinced me to stay." "You're right." "Of course I'm right. All you have to do to keep both sets of my parents happy is to allow them to indulge me once in a while. I have a much harder road ahead of me with your mom." "You're kidding, right?" "My mom adores you." "No, she doesn't." "Yes, she does. You became Catholic." "I was already Catholic." "But not on paper." "God doesn't care about paper." "But my mother does. We've been through this." "Yes, we have, and all I can say is that it's a good thing Joe is a priest, and he believed us when we told him about the pocket watch. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten the paperwork until next Easter. Still, my becoming Catholic on paper didn't suddenly make her love me. It started the ball rolling. Asking her to teach you how to cook went a long way, too." "Who wouldn't want to learn to cook like that?" Gabe chuckled. "How could my mother not love an attitude like that?" "Well, she seems awfully critical for someone who you think likes me." "She criticizes all of us. Do you not pay any attention? That's her way of saying I love you. If she didn't love you, she'd treat you like a guest." He shifted into an imitation of his mother's voice. "Joseph, how many times do I have to tell you, get a haircut? Luke, you're a slob. At least get your clothes near the hamper. Tony, what, you can't come home once in a while for Sunday dinner? Angela, you want a good man like your father. You've got to be able to feed him." Elizabeth is already a much better cook than you, and she's not even Italian. Dominic, when are you going to stop dating every floozy with a tight skirt and fake boobs that crosses your path, and settle down with a nice girl like Elizabeth? You better treat her like a princess, Gabriel, or I'll have to knock some sense into you. Elsie stared at him for a moment. She said those things? Yeah, she did. You have a big heart, and you're hard not to like. Elsie smiled. So, Principessa, were you happy with the way the wedding turned out? I loved it. She chuckled, remembering how one of the altar servers, a 13-year-old neighbor of the Soldanis, absolutely gushed. Didn't you hear? It was perfect, absolutely perfect. Perfect in every way. The weather was perfect, the flowers were perfect, the blue dresses were perfect. It was just perfect. Gabe chuckled too. Yeah, Maggie Mitchell mentioned that to me once or twice, or 15 times. I have to agree. It was perfect in every way. Elsie sighed and turned to look out the window again. I still can't believe I'm flying. How high in the air are we? I understand private jets cruise at 41,000 feet or higher. How far is that? It's over 7 miles, close to 8. You're kidding. I'm not kidding. But that does remind me of something. We have the perfect opportunity to join the Mile High Club. What's that? Oh, my innocent little wife. One joins the Mile High Club by having sex in an airplane. She grinned. I think I definitely want to be a member of that club. The Grand Canal, Venice, July 9th, 2006. Their honeymoon was supposed to be a quick trip to Italy, but about a month before the wedding, Gabe had been offered a position in a suburban pediatric practice. He negotiated a late August start date so that he and Elsie could have time to find a place to live, move, get married, and take an extended holiday. They flew to Rome and spent 2 weeks touring Italy, winding up in Venice. They would soon be boarding a ship for a 14-day cruise of the Adriatic. When they returned, the Sinclairs' private jet would take them to Scotland for another 8 days before they flew home. At every planned stop, the hotel rooms had been upgraded to the best available, and he suspected it would be no different on the cruise ship. These upgrades had oldest Sinclair's hand all over them, but Gabe didn't complain. Beside the fact that it would do no good, his medieval wife, who before she awoke in NYUHC had never ventured farther than the village in which she was born, was having a marvelous time, which meant he was having a marvelous time. Her enthusiasm was infectious. As they rode the water taxi to the cruise terminal, her joyful face watched the sights of the Grand Canal go by. Enthralled with his beautiful wife, Gabe took in fewer of the sights around him. He noticed instantly when her brows drew together as they neared the Rialto Bridge. "Elsie, what is it?" he asked as his head turned in the direction she was looking. "There, on the bridge, is that? It can't be." "What, sweetheart?" "That looks like Gertrude. There, on the steps." He caught a brief glimpse of a sharply dressed older woman, who could have been Gertrude, but a group of people stepped in front of her, blocking his view. He craned his head to try to get a better look at the woman before the taxi went under the bridge. At the last minute the people moved, and he saw her. "It is Gertrude!" Elsie exclaimed. She looked directly at them, waved, blew them a kiss, and in true Gertrude style, simply disappeared. The end. Acknowledgements. The devil is in the details, and I like to get them right as often as I can. I owe a huge thank you to my friend and colleague Dr. Brian Murphy, MD, MPH, FIDSA, who not only helped me make sure the emergency medical details were accurate, but also explained the residency matching process. Many thanks to my dear friend Paul Vincent, my expert on all things related to EMS. Thank you for your years of service as a fire commissioner and volunteer firefighter. Another big thank you goes to my cousin Gerald Bowen, who helped me understand certain police procedures. Also thank you for your years of service as both a police officer and a U.S. Marine. And finally, a sincere thank you to Mustafa Alami of the New York City Cab Company, who provided information on how luggage left in a cab would normally be handled. We hope you've enjoyed Once Found, the Pocket Watch Chronicles, written by Ceci Giltenan, narrated by Paul Woodson. Copyright 2016 by Ceci Giltenan. Production copyright 2016 by Dunkura LLC.